Hi everyone. We're going to focus the rest of this from 1945 to the present, and I promise it will not be as long as the last review. It will be considerably shorter. And so let's get started. All right, so part of this key concept is post-war economic growth supported an increase in welfare benefits. However, subsequent economic stagnation led to criticism and limitation of the welfare state. So a few things you need to know. Number one, period from the 40s, late 40s through the 70s, 60s, are really increasing prosperity. 70s was a worldwide recession, a period of stagflation, oil crises. It was just a terrible time for the economies. And so there we'll see that economic stagnation. And then after the baby boom, especially, we're going to see continued limitations placed on the welfare state. So the first question, what is the welfare state? And I think we're going to see basically European countries sought to provide universal services to all their people. And it would be universal, not just aimed at the poor and unemployed, which had largely been the case before World War I. One of the results was there was a significant reduction of class tensions that had really existed for centuries. But we'll see some of these services to people, employment benefits or unemployment benefits, disability insurance, Social Security for the elderly, usually free and subsidized health care. Uh, and generally, this was paid through higher taxes. And generally, that higher taxes were on wealthier citizens. And, ultimately, we're going to see this shaped through the Christian Democrats in West Germany. Uh, Others in France and Italy are going to play a key role in shaping the welfare state. And while the European economy grew in the 50s and 60s, government could more or less meet the expenses of the welfare state. Britain kind of became the model for the welfare state and a mixed economy. Britain actually began, it nationalized the Bank of England, the coal mines, gas, iron, steel. And although 80% of the industry remained private, we're going to see, this 50s and 60s, these increased social benefits in Britain, social insurance for unemployment, workers' compensation, and so forth. And this is going to remain intact. Like I said, that was introduced in the 40s, remain intact in the 50s and 60s. By the 70s, there's a lot of talk about that, which we'll come to that later on. But moving on, so what enabled this? And part of it was that the Marshall Plan led to what we call. And if you remember the Marshall Plan from the United States sunk, I think, $13.5 billion into Western Europe to begin recovery. It was actually offered to all nations, including the Soviet Union and their satellites. The Soviets and satellites declined to take any Marshall Plan aid. They felt that it was another example of American imperialism. But the government's, giving this money, and it was a gift. The governments had to do. There were a few regulations. Number one, they had to accept Keynesian economics to stimulate their economies. They also had to use, deficit spending to make resources available to the people. And ultimately, most countries, many workers are willing to work hard. That kind of benefited, and we're going to see as a result an increased demand for consumer goods. Many economic barriers were eliminated, thus this economic miracle, and a large, we talked earlier about the creation of the common market as well. And this whole idea, this strong economy, full employment, really is going to become a big issue, or not a big issue, an important way of life in Western Europe throughout the 50s and 60s. It led to this increased consumerism and so forth. Talked already about the cradle to grave welfare programs and the high taxes, but by the late 20th century, this is going to become you know, a contentious issue. And I'm going to use the model for Britain as an example. At first, this was very much accepted in Britain. However, by the 1970s, during this period of stagflation, these oil crises, conservatives started to argue that the welfare state had become excessive. High taxation was stunting economic growth, and so we're going to see some trimming of the welfare state. And in Britain, by the 1980s, the conservative Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher is going to begin doing several things that are going to make a much more moderate welfare state. She's going to begin privatizing some of those industries that I said earlier had been taken over, had been state-owned. She's going to restrict labor strikes and really kind of go to war against the unions. And interestingly, it worked in Britain. By the 1990s, Britain was in the best economic shape that it had been in since prior to World War One. But there were some expenses there. Margaret Thatcher was not necessarily loved by all of the population. And so, she was conservative Labor Party leaders did not reverse her policies afterwards. But we do see, this idea that what to do, and especially even into the 21st century now, now that the baby boomers are coming of age, what to do, because most of Western Europe is practices a democratic form of socialism. And, with the baby boomers coming of age and now people having less kids than ever, there's real question about the ability to pay for the welfare state, and thus why it's become such a domestic issue overall. Another key concept from this is on Eastern European nations and how they were defined by their relationship with the Soviet Union. Kind of went back between repression and limited reforms through the 50s, 60s, and 70s until Mikhail Gorbachev's policies in the 80s led to the collapse of the communist governments in the fall of the Soviet Union. So I want to talk a little bit about the satellite countries and some of the economic policies. So the satellite countries: Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Romania. For the most part, Comecon kind of guided the economies of these countries. Just use common sense. They began to industrialize following the Soviet model, thus 5-year plans. Agriculture was collectivized, and the countries began to develop. While they weren't as strong as the Western countries, these countries weren't necessarily poor, but they did rely upon socialism and communism to get through. While Stalin was alive, the policies in these countries were pretty harsh. But after Stalin's death in 1953, Nikita Khrushchev becomes the new premier of the Soviet Union, and he begins a policy of de-Stalinization. And so I want to talk first about de-Stalinization in the Soviet Union. In 1956, Khrushchev made a secret speech to the 20th Party Congress where he renounced Stalin. He blamed Stalin for the Soviet Union's unpreparedness at the beginning of the war. He blamed Stalin for the purges and deportations. And ultimately, we're going to see a kinder, gentler Soviet Union emerge under the rule of Khrushchev. There'll be more freedoms, but not total freedom. So, a good example would be the Russian dissidents, to give an idea. Alexander Solzhenitsyn had been imprisoned in the gulags, and he had been released, and he wrote a book called One Day in the Life of Ivan Desenovich. And this book basically described a day in the life in the gulags. Under Khrushchev, this book was printed and allowed to be published, and that kind of shows this new degree of tolerance that is going to exist in the Soviet Union that would have never happened during the Stalinist era. But there were limits. And so another dissident, Boris Pasternak, who wrote Dr. Zhivago, which kind of not downplays, but talks negatively about the Russian Revolution of 1917. Dr. Zhivago was not published in the Soviet Union. When Pasternak won a Nobel Peace Prize, he was not allowed to leave to go get it. And that shows the limits of freedoms of speech, how much there would be allowed. Interestingly, though, he wasn't sent back to a labor camp. So, you do see. And so this idea under Khrushchev, this de-Stalinization occurs more focused on consumer goods and building up. We will see, a modest prosperity through the 50s and 60s. And the late 60s even, increased consumer goods and just more appliances than ever before in the Soviet Union. We're also, though, when Stalin dies, we're going to see de-Stalinization go to the satellites. And the satellites are allowed a degree of independence. And so a good example of this is Poland in the early 50s. Poland was a very Catholic country, and probably the most oppressing feature of communism in Poland was the oppression of the Catholic Church. And so after Stalin's death, the Catholic Church was able to revitalize itself in Poland and allowed to play a role in the country, which was quite important. Following these reforms from Poland, we're going to see something similar happen in Hungary. And in 1956, Imre Nagy becomes the leader of Hungary, and he begins to make Hungary a more free country, so to speak. First, he begins to allow opposition parties to exist, and then he announces Hungary's withdrawal from the Warsaw Pact. And once again, this is going to demonstrate how far the Soviets were willing to go. While the Catholic Church was okay in Poland, withdrawing from the Warsaw Pact was not okay in Hungary. Opposition parties were not okay, and in 1956, the Soviet Union sent in the tanks into Budapest, and the world watched while Budapest became a slaughterhouse. The Hungarians expected aid from the West. In fact, the United States VOA, or Voice of America broadcast, had encouraged the citizens of these countries to rise up against the Soviets, but this didn't quite follow containment, and the United States and Western Europe were not about to risk World War III for Hungary, and we're going to see Nagy executed and a more stricter Hungarian regime begins to rule that country. A very similar one occurs in 1968 in Czechoslovakia. During the Prague Spring, a guy named Alexander Dubček wants to introduce socialism with the human face. And although the Soviet leader at this time was Brezhnev, as Dubček began liberalizing things in Czechoslovakia, Brezhnev felt he was going too far and sent in the tanks, and the Prague Spring was also put down and a more strict regime set up in Czechoslovakia as well. Throughout the 70s, we'll see Brezhnev in the Soviet Union, and we'll see some repression continue. There was actually the period of détente from 72 to 79 between the United States and the Soviet Union. And at the Helsinki Conference in 1975, Brezhnev promised to improve human rights. He didn't. And we talked earlier about the end of détente when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979. So let's talk about through the 80s, we're going to see the Soviet Union become very kind of in a tough situation. President Reagan, inaugurated in 1981, has a much tougher policy towards the Soviet Union and reignites the arms race with them. And while we were able to maintain our standard of living while continuing to pour trillions of dollars into weapons, the Soviets struggled. Soviets always had shortages. The shortages became more acute. Combine that with the fact that Brezhnev died in 82 and hardliner named Yuri Andropov became the new premier. He died a year later than Konstantin Chernenko. And at this point, the Soviets see something has to be done. And in 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev, the youngest member of the Politburo, is elected as the premier. And we're going to see different changes. And one of the first things, everyone knows Gorbachev as the guy who got rid of communism, but Gorbachev was actually a dedicated communist. He didn't feel that communism was a bad system. In fact, he was very much in favor of it, but he felt it had not been used correctly in the Soviet Union. It was a corrupted system, and he wanted to fix it. And so he did a few things to fix it. Number one, glasnost, or openness. And this idea of glasnost, or openness, would be basic freedoms given to the Soviet people. So for example, there are a lot of problems, but we can't fix those problems if we can't talk about them. And we are going to see, more freedoms in the Soviet Union. And especially what's going to hurt Gorbachev later on is when the subject nationalism begins to assert its ugly head. And we see independence movements in the Baltic states of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, as well in other areas. But there was this freedom of speech that was allowed. Also, Gorbachev recognizes that they had to redo the economy. That's perestroika, or restructuring of the economy, allowing some capitalism and many necessary but painful changes. Whereas, the arms race had led to an acute shortage of goods, the shortage became even worse under perestroika, and many people blamed Gorbachev. And while Gorbachev was extremely popular in the West, Americans loved him, he was not so popular in the Soviet Union because of these shortages that were associated with his regime. And we talked earlier about the fall of the USSR. We know that 1989, as Eastern Europe begins to experience independence movements, the Soviets pledged not to interfere, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And we do know that by 1991, basically, the Soviet Union ceased to exist, and that was the end. So let's go on. We are going to see new nationalisms emerge in Central and Eastern Europe, especially during the late 80s, as Gorbachev was liberalizing his policies. And so in 1989, we're going to see revolutions in both Poland and Hungary. So I want to talk a little bit about what was going on in both of those countries. So we're going to start with Poland. We're going to back up a little bit, kind of reminder. In the 70s, the Polish economy was in horrific shape, and a trade union named Solidarity began to grow. It was led by Lech Wałęsa, and it really kind of grew into a political party. And by 1980, the Polish government actually allowed Solidarity to exist. It legalized it with the Gdansk Accords. But by 1981, the Polish government, under pressure from the Soviets, banned Solidarity. And we're going to see throughout the 80s solidarity band yet continue to grow. The Polish were not really willing to be total totalitarian against solidarity and enforce much, but we will see, world attention on solidarity. Combine that with the election of Pope John Paul II in the late 70s as the first non-Italian pope in over 400 years, that was constantly calling the world's attention to the problems in Poland, the issues that were going on in Poland. And so that continues through the 80s. By 1989, when there were some reforms in Hungary, and the Hungarians began to liberalize their regime, the world stood waiting. The last time the Hungarians had done this, Budapest became the slaughterhouse. But Gorbachev pledged not to interfere. And as the Hungarian borders were open mid-year with Austria, we're going to see a rush of East Germans coming down through Hungary to cross over into Austria and into West Germany. Same time, 1989, free elections in Poland and Solidarity, which was legalized again, and Lech Wałęsa wins the first free elections. And 1989, these year of miracles, these elections all begin and, all last. And then all begin. These elections all occur with very little violence. The only real country that had violence was Romania, as their leader, their dictator Nicolae Ceausescu, and his wife were captured, and Ceausescu was shot as well. But we see very little violence in those revolutions, and we see basically their freedom and the end of the Warsaw Pact. We're also going to see, though, in the 1990s, as a result of this nationalism, war and genocide in the Balkans, both in Bosnia and Kosovo. So, in 1999, President Slobodan Milosevic sought a Serbian-dominated Yugoslavia. If you remember, Yugoslavia post-World War II was led by Tito, who had basically, he was a Croatian, he kept the minorities together. And remember, Yugoslavia is this land, you have several different Slavic groups, including Serbians, Croatians, Bosnians, Macedonians, Kosovars, Albanians, etc. But there's also three major religions, Eastern Orthodox, Islam, and Roman Catholic. And so after Tito's death, we're going to see increased nationalism amongst these groups. And by 1990, as Milosevic seeks to make Serbia the dominant nation, he's going to establish tighter control over some of these areas that had gained a good degree of autonomy. And in response to this, Croatia and Slovenia declare independence and fight Yugoslavia/Serbia successfully. Bosnia declared its independence in 1991, and by 1992, 1992 is when Bosnia declared its independence, and we're going to see civil war spread there. About 30% of the population were Bosnian Serbs, and they refused to live in a Bosnian Muslim-dominated state. And they began military operations against the Bosnian Muslims, and they were assisted by Serbia and the Yugoslav Federal Army. And the Bosnian major city of Sarajevo came under attack. The Bosnian Serbs used a policy of ethnic cleansing. They tried to liquidate or remove Muslims by shelling cities, confiscating or destroying houses, expulsion, gang rape, and murder. Several 100,000 Bosnians were killed. Some Bosnians were also killed in the north by Croatian nationals who claimed land in northern Bosnia. And the world watched as this occurred during 93 and 94. And finally, in 1995, the Dayton Agreements, all parties agreed to divide Bosnia between Muslims and Serbs. And Bosnian Serb aspirations to join a greater Serbia would be frustrated by U.S. and other NATO troops sent to enforce these Dayton Agreements. Milosevic remained in power in Yugoslavia/Serbia and remained somewhat of a pariah. In 1998, though, we're going to see the Kosovar crisis begin. And this was when Milosevic attempted to ethnically cleanse a province within Yugoslavia called Kosovo. The majority of the people were Albanian Muslims, but this had been the heartland of ancient Serbia, and tens of thousands, though, of ethnic Albanians fled Kosovo to neighboring countries to escape a potential genocide. This time, NATO and the U.S. acted much quicker. They started to bomb Serbia to stop this ethnic cleansing. Perhaps 10,000 Kosovars were killed by, Serbian forces, and, the bombing kind of put it down. Milosevic was removed from power by 2000, placed under international charges for war crimes. He actually died in prison in 2006 before he was tried. Kosovo declared its independence from Serbia in 2008. It has not been recognized by the UN due to Russian objections. Spain also objects. Remember we talked earlier about Spanish and the Basque minority. Both, Russia and Spain object because of this idea of recognizing it would be someone similar if someone were to recognize Chechnya or the Basque in those areas. But the United States has recognized it, and it is a part of Europe's newest country today. And finally, we're going to see some instability in some former Soviet republics. I just want to briefly talk about the Ukraine, and just kind of, reiterate, because this is a very modern example. Back in 2014, the Russian army annexed the area known as the Crimea. Crimea belonged to the Ukraine. It was an interesting annexation because the majority of the Crimea were actually ethnic Russians. And in the Ukraine, an anti-Russian leader was elected, and many wanted to join with Russia. Uh, the world pretty much did nothing as Putin went in there. But then we're going to begin to see a revolt in the eastern part of the Ukraine where ethnic Russians begin to revolt against the Ukrainian government. And at this point, the world has been watching as, Putin has given arms and assistance to these rebels in the eastern Ukraine. And we're really unsure where it's headed into the future. But it does show this nationalism that still exists, throughout, and has really kind of reared its ugly head since 1989, since those revolutions. And that is it for today. Our next key concept will be 4.3, intellectual and cultural movement.